Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. I reckon I was about 30 years old at the time, strong as an ox, full of vinegar, and thought I knew everything there was to know about fishing. Had been fishing these waters since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, learning from my daddy and his daddy before him. We knew the tides like the back of our hands, knew where the snook liked to hide, where the redfish liked to run, knew the call of every bird and the rustle of every gator in the sawgrass, or at least I thought I did. This particular trip, I was after something special, a trophy snook. Now a snook, that's a fish with a bit of a personality, smart, cunning, and powerful. They lurk around mangrove roots, waiting to ambush prey, and they fight like the devil when you hook them. I'd caught my share before, but I was after a real monster, one that folks would talk about. So I loaded up my old skiff, the Lucky Lady, a name more ironic than anything, mind you, with my gear, my trusty rod, a box of lures, a cooler full of iced-down beer, and a ham sandwich my wife, bless her heart, had packed for me. I set off early, before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of salt water and decaying vegetation. That's the smell of the Everglades, son, a smell that gets in your blood and never leaves. I headed deep into the backwaters, places where most folks wouldn't dare to go. It was a maze of narrow channels, twisting and turning through the mangroves, the roots like gnarled fingers reaching out of the water. The only sound was the hum of my little outboard motor and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. Perfect fishing weather. I spent the whole morning casting around, trying different lures, different spots, but nothing. Just a few small snapper and a pesky jack crevalle that nearly spooled my reel. I was getting frustrated, the sweat dripping down my face, the sun beating down unmercifully. Maybe the snook weren't biting today, I thought. Maybe I should just pack it in and head home for a cold beer. But then I remembered what my daddy used to say. Patience, Jerry, patience. The best fish always come to those who wait. So I took a deep breath, cracked open a beer, and decided to give it another hour. I motored further into the maze, deeper than I had ever been before. The channels got narrower, the mangroves thicker, and the air felt even more stifling. It was like navigating through a green tunnel, the sunlight barely penetrating the canopy above. I started to feel a little uneasy, like I was being watched. Then I found it, a small lagoon, completely hidden from the main channel, surrounded by a wall of mangroves. The water was crystal clear, and I could see bait fish darting around the roots. It was a snook haven, no doubt about it. I cut the engine and drifted silently into the lagoon. The silence was deafening, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from the mangrove leaves. I could feel my heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation building. I tied on my favorite lure, a big topwater plug that mimicked a mullet, and made my first cast. Plop. It landed right next to a mangrove root, and I started to twitch it back, making it dance on the surface of the water. Nothing. I cast again. Same spot. Plop. Twitch. 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 Still nothing. I was about to give up when, bam, the water exploded. A huge snook, bigger than any I'd ever seen, came flying out of the water, mouth wide open, and engulfed my lure. I set the hook hard, and the fight was on. That snook pulled like a freight train. It ran deep, trying to tangle my line around the mangrove roots. I held on tight, my reel screaming, my arms aching. It was a battle of wills, me against the fish, and I was determined to win. For what felt like an eternity, we fought, back and forth, the snook taking line, then me gaining it back. I was sweating bullets, my muscles burning, but I wasn't about to give up. This was the fish of a lifetime. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, the snook started to tire. I slowly reeled it closer until I could see it clearly in the water. It was magnificent, a silver torpedo with a black stripe down its side, easily over 30 pounds. Biggest snook I'd ever laid eyes on. I reached for my net, ready to land it, when I heard a sound. A low, guttural growl. I froze, my blood running cold. I knew that sound. I'd heard it before, many times. It was the sound of an alligator. I slowly turned my head, and there it was, lying on the bank, half submerged in the water, was an alligator bigger than my skiff. Its eyes were fixed on me, cold and calculating. Its jaws were slightly open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Now I'd seen alligators before, plenty of them. They're a common sight in the Everglades. But this one was different. This one was massive, ancient, and mean-looking. It was like something out of a prehistoric nightmare. I knew in that instant that I was in serious trouble. The alligator started to move, slowly sliding into the water. It swam towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. The snook, still hooked, thrashed wildly in the water, only making matters worse. I had a choice to make. I could try to fight the alligator, but I knew I wouldn't stand a chance. Or I could cut my line and let the snook go, hoping that the alligator would go after the fish instead of me. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd fought hard for that snook, and I wasn't about to give it up without a fight. But I knew that my life was worth more than any fish. With a heavy heart, I reached for my knife and cut the line. The snook, free from the hook, darted away, disappearing into the murky water. The alligator paused for a moment, then turned its attention to the fish. It lunged forward, and with a snap of its jaws, it swallowed the snook whole. Then it turned back to me. It swam closer until it was right next to my skiff. I could see the details of its skin, the scars and bumps, the wrinkles around its eyes. It was close enough that I could smell its musky odor, a smell that reeked of death and decay. Held my breath, trying not to move, hoping that it would just leave me alone. But it didn't. It bumped my skiff with its snout, gently at first, then harder. It was testing me, seeing if I was a threat. I knew that if it wanted to, it could easily flip my skiff over and drag me into the water. And once I was in the water, I'd be as good as dead. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the inevitable. But then something strange happened. The alligator stopped, bumping my skiff. It just stared at me, its eyes cold and unblinking. Then it let out a low hiss, a sound that sent chills down my spine. And then it turned and swam away. I watched it go, disappear into the mangroves until it was gone. I sat there for a long time, my heart still pounding, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd come face to face with death, and somehow I'd survived. Slowly, I started the engine and turned the skiff around. I didn't care about fishing anymore. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. I motored back through the channels, my mind reeling. The images of the alligator burned into my memory. I didn't stop until I reached the open water where I could see the horizon. I never went back to that lagoon, not ever. And for a long time, I couldn't even look at an alligator without feeling a shiver run down my spine. Now, some folks might say that I was just lucky, that the alligator wasn't hungry, or that it was just having a bad day. But I know better. I believe that alligator was something more than just an animal. I believe it was a guardian of the Everglades, a protector of the wild, a symbol of the power and the mystery of the swamp. And I believe that it spared me that day because it knew that I respected the Everglades, that I understood its ways, that I was just a humble fisherman trying to make a living. Or maybe it was just because I let it eat my snook. Either way, it was a lesson I'll never forget. A lesson about the power of nature, the importance of respect, and the fact that sometimes the best thing you can do is just cut your losses and run. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. I was fishing for tuna that day, out past the usual spots, chasing a rumor of a big school further offshore. You know how it is with fishermen, always chasing the big one, even if it's just a whisper on the wind. The morning started like any other. Sunrise painting the sky in these streaks of pink and orange, making the water shimmer like 1,000 scattered jewels. Air was salty and clean, a gentle breeze kissing my face. The engine was humming smooth, the rhythm of the sea beneath me. I had my coffee in my thermos, strong and black as night, and a couple of them day-old biscuits Mama used to make, still warm in the foil. Just me, the ocean, and the promise of a good catch. I got out further than I usually did that day. The water was deep, deep blue, the kind that swallows the sky whole. You could feel the depth of it beneath you. This ancient, powerful place made you feel small, but in a good way, you know, like you were a tiny part of something grand, something that had been here long before you and would be here long after. I set my lines, deep lines for tuna, heavy weights and strong hooks, and then I waited. Fishing ain't always about the catch, son. Sometimes it's about the waiting. It's about the peace, the quiet, the rhythm of the waves. It's about watching the clouds drift by and listening to the gulls cry. It's a meditation in a way. Out there on the water, the world shrinks down to just you and the sea. All the worries and troubles back on land, they just kind of fade away. Hours went by. The sun climbed higher, beating down on my neck. I reeled in a couple of smaller tuna. Nice enough, but nothing to write home about. I was starting to think maybe that rumor was just that, a rumor. Maybe I'd come all this way for nothing, but something kept me out there. A feeling, a hunch maybe. Fishermen, we learn to trust our hunches. The ocean whispers secrets if you know how to listen. I was just about to pack it in and head back closer to shore when it happened. It started subtly, a change in the water, a ripple, but not from the wind, a disturbance beneath the surface, too big for a school of fish. I cut the engine just out of habit, wanting to hear better, to feel better. The salty dog drifted, bobbing gentle in the swell. The only sound was the slap of the waves against the hull and the distant cry of a gull. Then I saw it, a shadow, deep, dark, huge, moving beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. For a moment my mind couldn't quite grasp what it was. Too big for a shark, too broad for a dolphin. I leaned over the side, squinting into the water, trying to make sense of it. And then it surfaced. Not all at once, not like in the movies, with a big splash and spray. It was gradual, majestic, like a mountain rising from the deep. First I saw the dark, smooth back, slick and glistening in the sun. It seemed to stretch on forever, this massive living thing. Then the blowhole erupted in a misty plume of vapor that hung in the air like a fleeting cloud. The sound, oh, that sound, a low, resonant whoosh, like the breath of the ocean itself. It was a blue whale, right there, not more than 50 yards from my little boat. A blue whale, the biggest creature on Earth, bigger than any dinosaur that ever walked the land. And it was right there in front of me. Time seemed to stop. Everything else faded away. The sun, the boat, the fishing lines, everything. There was only the whale and me in this vast expanse of ocean. I just stared, mouth probably hanging open like a fool. I'd seen whales before, of course. Pilot whales, humpbacks, even a sperm whale once, way off in the distance. But never nothing like this, nothing this immense. It swam slowly, gracefully, like it wasn't even trying. Each movement of its colossal tail sent ripples across the water, rocking the salty dog gently. I could see the patterns on its skin, mottled blues and grays, like a living map of the ocean floor. Its eye, when it turned its head towards me, was small in proportion to its body, but it held an ancient wisdom, a calmness that seemed to look right through me. It was close enough that I could see the baleen plates in its mouth, filtering tiny krill from the water. Imagine something that big, feeding on something so small. The sheer scale of it all was breathtaking. It humbled me in a way I can't quite explain. Made me realize how small and insignificant I was, but also how lucky I was to be witness to this incredible creature. I didn't move, didn't breathe, hardly. I just watched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20, maybe 30 minutes. It circled my boat a couple of times, slow and deliberate, like it was curious, inspecting this tiny speck that had invaded its domain. And then just as suddenly as it appeared, it started to move away. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. It dipped beneath the surface, its massive tail fluke rising out of the water like a dark sail before disappearing into the depths. And then it was gone, just like that. The water settled, the ripples faded, and the ocean was calm again, like it had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time after it was gone, just staring at the empty water. My heart was still thumping in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. It felt like a dream, something that couldn't possibly be real. But it was real. I'd seen it. I'd been in the presence of a blue whale. I didn't catch any more fish that day. Didn't even try. The tuna, the rumor, all of it was forgotten. How could any fish compare to what I'd just witnessed? It felt disrespectful somehow to go back to chasing after smaller things after that. I started the engine, turned the salty dog towards home. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold now. The breeze felt different, cooler, carrying the scent of evening and the faraway shore. The whole way back, I kept thinking about that whale, its size, its grace, its quiet power. It made me think about the ocean, about life, about everything, really. It made me realize how much we still don't know about this world, how many wonders are still hidden beneath the surface, out there in the deep blue. You know, son, you spend your life fishing. You think you've seen it all. You think you understand the ocean, at least a little bit. But then something like that happens, something so unexpected, so magnificent, that it reminds you just how much you don't know. It reminds you that the ocean is still full of mysteries, still full of surprises, and that's what keeps you coming back, day after day, year after year. It's the wonder of it all. I never saw another blue whale that close again, not in all my years of fishing. I've heard tell of others seeing them further out in deeper waters, but that one was special. It was like the ocean herself decided to show me something truly amazing, something to remind me why I fell in love with the sea in the first place. So yeah, that's my blue whale story. Just a simple fisherman in a little boat on a big ocean, having a moment with a giant. Doesn't sound like much, maybe, when I tell it like this. But out there on the water, that day, it was something else entirely. Something I'll never forget. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back. And when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. The sea, she's a fickle mistress. Always has been, always will be. You can be best friends with her 1 minute, and the next, she's trying to swallow you whole. But there's one story. Yeah, there's one that sticks in my craw, even after all these years. It was back, must have been late 80s, maybe early 90s. Hard to keep track. Years start blurring together like the wake behind a shrimp trawler. But I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was beaten down like a blacksmith's hammer that morning. Hot, even for June. But the air, it had that salt-tinged bite to it, you know. The kind that makes you feel alive, ready to tackle anything. The Gulf was flat and shiny like a mirror, reflecting that big old sun right back. And the sky was the clearest blue you ever did see. Perfect fishing weather, as far as the eye could tell. I was younger then, not exactly spry anymore, mind you, but younger. Still had most of my hair, and what was left wasn't quite as gray as it is now. 68 ain't old for some folks, but it's old for a man who spent his life battling the elements. Back then, though, 68 felt a lifetime away. I was maybe 40-something, strong as an ox. Thought I could handle anything the ocean tossed at me. Pride, son. Pride can be a dangerous thing on the water. Anyway, I'd gotten up before dawn, like always, made myself a strong pot of coffee and a couple of biscuits, slathered them with some grits and gravy. Fuel for the day, you see. Checked over the salty dog, my old Grady White, before I even left the dock. Engine sounded purty. Fuel's topped off. Tackle box loaded, bait fresh. Everything was in ship shape. I was heading out deep that day, maybe 20-25 miles offshore, hunting for some grouper. My mouth was already watering, thinking about a big old fried grouper sandwich for supper. The ride out was smooth as silk. Just me and the sound of the engine humming along, the smell of salt air, and the wide open blue as far as you could see. Felt like I was the only soul in the world. And sometimes that's exactly what a man needs. I got to my spot, dropped anchor, baited my lines with some cut mullet, and tossed them overboard. Then I just sat back, leaned against the gunwale, and waited. The sun was climbing higher, starting to really bake down, but there was a nice breeze picking up, keeping things comfortable. The fishing started off slow, just a few nibbles here and there, a couple of small snapper, nothing to write home about. But I wasn't worried. Grouper are patient fish, and you got to be patient to catch them. I just enjoyed the peace and quiet, watched the waves gently rock the boat, and listened to the seagulls crying overhead. Then around midday, things started to pick up. Bang, rod bent double, reel screaming, fish on. It was a good one, I could tell. Started pulling drag, making my arms burn. After a good 10-minute fight, up she comes, a beautiful fat gag grouper. Must have been pushing 20 pounds. Just what I was looking for. I hauled her aboard, slipped the hook out, and tossed her in the cooler, grinning from ear to ear. All right, Jerry, I thought. This is going to be a good day after all. I rebait my hook, throw it back in, and not even 5 minutes later, bam, another one. This time it was a scamp, smaller than the first one, but still a keeper. I was having myself a fishing bonanza. I must have landed 5 or 6 good-sized grouper in the next couple of hours. My cooler was getting heavy. My arms were getting tired, but I was happy as a clam. Sun was directly overhead now, beating down something fierce, but I was too caught up in the fishing to really notice. And then it happened. I was just reeling in another one, this time a feisty little snapper that didn't quite make the size limit. As I was letting him go, I heard it, a cough, a sputter, then silence. The engine just died, just like that, quiet as a church mouse on Sunday morning. My heart dropped down into my boots. Silence on the water. When you're used to the rumble of an engine, it's a silence that screams. I looked at the console. Gauges all dead. Nothing moving. Damnation, I muttered to myself. Don't tell me this is happening. First thing I did was try to restart her. Turn the key, nothing. Not even a click. Tried again and again. Still nothing. Just that awful dead silence. Okay, Jerry, don't panic, I told myself. Engine trouble happens. You've dealt with it before. I popped the engine hatch, grabbed my toolkit, and started poking around. Checked the fuel lines, checked the battery connections, checked everything I could think of. Nothing obvious. Didn't smell gas. Battery terminals were clean. Everything looked fine. But she just wouldn't start. It was like she just decided to take a nap, right there in the middle of the Gulf. I spent maybe an hour, sweat pouring down my face, trying to figure it out. Wrenched on bolts, jiggled wires, cursed under my breath. Nothing worked. Finally, I slumped back against the gunwale, wiped the grime and sweat off my brow with my forearm, and let out a long sigh. Well, I'll be hornswoggled, I said to myself. Looks like you're in a bit of a pickle, old man. I grabbed my radio, flipped it on, and tried to hail the Coast Guard. Coast Guard, Coast Guard. This is fishing vessel, Salty Dog, over. Nothing but static. Tried again, louder this time. Coast Guard, Salty Dog, calling Mayday, Mayday, engine failure, 20 miles offshore, need assistance, over. Still nothing but crackly static. Damn radio was dead too. Just my luck. I must have drifted out of range, or maybe something was wrong with the antenna. Whatever it was, I was on my own. 20 miles out, engine dead, radio dead, and the sun, beaten down like the devil himself, was stoking the furnace. That's when the realization really sunk in. I was stranded, really stranded, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but water and sky all around. The breeze had died down too, and the boat was just sitting there, bobbing gently in the swell. The silence was even heavier now, pressing down on me. I looked around. No other boats in sight. Nothing on the horizon but that endless blue. It was just me, the salty dog, and the big old gulf, and the sun, of course, that relentless, unforgiving sun. I knew I had to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't do me no good. First things first, water. I checked my cooler. Had a couple of bottles left. Not much. Food. A handful of granola bars. Not exactly a feast. Sunscreen. Yeah, I'd put some on that morning, but it was probably sweated off hours ago. Hat. Check. Sunglasses. Check. Not exactly prepared for a desert island situation, but it was something. The sun was just relentless, beaten down, burning my skin. I found my old canvas tarp, rigged it up as best I could to give me some shade over the console area. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sipped slowly on my water, trying to make it last. Granola bar tasted like sawdust, but I ate it anyway. Needed to keep my strength up, whatever that meant now. The hours crawled by. The sun moved slowly across the sky, dragging its feet like it was deliberately trying to torture me. The heat was stifling, even under the tarp. Sweat was just pouring off me, even though I wasn't doing nothing, just sitting there, waiting. For what? I didn't even know. Hope, maybe. Just a sliver of hope that someone would come along, or that the radio would miraculously start working again, or that I'd suddenly figure out what was wrong with the engine. But as the afternoon wore on, that hope started to dwindle. The sun got lower in the sky, painting the clouds in fiery oranges and reds as it started to set. Beautiful, yeah, but beauty don't do you much good when you're stranded and thirsty and starting to feel that tickle of fear in the pit of your stomach. That's when they showed up, the seagulls. They'd been circling overhead all day, of course, scavengers always on the lookout for a free meal. But now, as the sun started to dip down, they started getting bolder, landing on the gunnel, walking around, pecking at bits of bait that were still lying around. They were big old gulls, the kind with the gray backs and yellow beaks. Ugly things, really, usually. But that day they were something else. They were company, the only company I had. And that's when I started talking to them. Well, hello there, fellas, I said, my voice crackly from the sun and thirst. Come to see what's for supper, have you? They just looked at me with those beady little eyes, heads cocked to one side, like they were actually listening. Or maybe they were just looking for handouts. Didn't matter. I needed to talk to someone, something, even if it was just a bunch of birds. Engine's gone kaput, I explained to them like they could understand. Radio's dead as a doornail. Stranded. Just me and you. One of the gulls hopped closer, pecked at a bit of rope on the deck. Don't suppose you know anything about engines, do you? I asked him. He just let out a squawk and hopped closer still. And then I just started talking, really talking. about everything, about fishing, about the sea, about my life, about my wife back home, about my grandkids, about my worries, about my fears, everything that was bubbling up inside me. I just let it out, pouring it all out to those seagulls. They just sat there listening, or at least appearing to listen. Sometimes they'd squawk back. Sometimes they'd just preen their feathers. But it felt good just to hear my own voice, to have someone, even if it was just seagulls, to talk to. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and darkness started to creep in, I was sunburned something fierce. My skin felt like it was on fire. My lips were cracked and dry, and my head was beginning to spin a little. Dehydration was setting in, I knew, but I still had a little water left, and I rationed it out, just tiny sips. The night was long, darker than dark out there with no moon, just the stars blazing bright overhead, and the sound of the waves whispering and slapping against the hull, and the seagulls still there, huddled together on the bow, looking like ghostly shapes in the darkness. I talked to them all night, about everything and nothing. I told them stories, sang them old sea shanties, even recited poetry from school. Stuff I hadn't thought about in years. My mind was starting to get a little hazy, the edges blurring together. The seagulls, they started feeling like friends, like kin. You understand, don't you? I'd mumble to them. You understand what it's like to be out here, alone, just us creatures of the sea. They'd just blink those beady eyes, and I'd swear sometimes they'd nod their heads, delirious probably, sunstroke and dehydration, playing tricks on my mind. But in that darkness, out there in the middle of the Gulf, the seagulls felt like the only real things left in the world. Dawn finally broke, slow and painful, like pulling teeth. The sun came up red and angry, beaten down again, even hotter than yesterday it seemed. I was parched, weak as a kitten, and my skin felt like it was going to crack and peel right off. The seagulls were still there, looking at me with those knowing eyes. Another day, eh, fellas? I croaked to them, my voice barely a whisper. Think we'll make it? Just then I heard it, faint at first, almost like a dream, a whirring sound, distant but getting closer. I strained my ears, listening. Yeah, there it was again, whirring, getting louder. An engine, but not a boat engine, a helicopter. My heart leapt in my chest. Hope, real hope, surged through me like a jolt of electricity. I scrambled to my feet, wobbly and weak, and looked around. And there it was, coming over the horizon, a little speck at first, then getting bigger and bigger, a Coast Guard helicopter. Tears welled up in my eyes, burning hot against my sunburned skin. They found us, I shouted to the seagulls, my voice breaking. They found us. We're saved. The helicopter circled overhead, the roar of the engine deafening now. I waved my arms, yelling and whooping like a fool, tears streaming down my face. They saw me. The helicopter hovered, then slowly descended, lower and lower, until it was just above the water alongside my boat. A rescue swimmer jumped out, swimming towards the salty dog. Strong young fella, looking like he'd just stepped out of a movie. He clambered aboard, checking me over, radioing back to the helicopter. Subject located, dehydrated and sunburned, but conscious, he said into his radio. Looks like he's been out here for a while. He looked at me, a kind smile on his face. You all right, sir? I could barely nod. Engine died, I managed to croak out. Radio, Dead too. He just nodded. We figured, he said. We got a distress call from a freighter, saw your flare gun go off last night, way after dark. Took us a while to pinpoint your location. Flare gun. Damn. I'd forgotten all about the flare gun. Too out of it to even think of it. Lucky someone saw it. Lucky to be alive. They got me hoisted up into the helicopter, wrapped me in a blanket, gave me water. The relief, it was overwhelming. Like a weight lifting off my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. As we lifted off, I looked back at the salty dog, bobbing alone in the waves. And then I looked at the seagulls, still perched on the bow, watching us go. I raised my hand, waved goodbye to them. Thanks, fellas, I whispered. Thanks for keeping me company. They just squawked back, and then the helicopter turned, and we headed back towards shore, back to civilization, back to life. They took me to the hospital, hooked me up to IVs, treated my sunburn. My wife and kids rushed to be there, worried sick, bless their hearts. When I finally got home after a couple of days, I was weak, shaky, and peeled like a bad sunburned tomato. But I was alive, and those seagulls. You know what? To this day, when I'm out on the water and the gulls are circling overhead, I always feel a little kinship with them, like they're looking out for me, like they remember that day out there in the middle of nowhere when we were all just drifting together. The sea, she's a hard mistress, but she's also got a strange kind of beauty to her. And sometimes, even in the darkest moments, you can find a little bit of comfort, even if it's just in talking to a bunch of seagulls. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fishing the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes. Talk of a monster grouper. They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years. 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink, and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates, and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it, so I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you got to understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't going to cut it with something like old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled, and once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, It was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the Wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, And don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See you all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.